So I want to talk about intelligence and increasing cognitive capacity. I've spent years studying the human mind, philosophy, Eastern and Western philosophy, evolutionary psychology, biology, learning theory, intelligence theory, and what I'm interested in is how to increase cognitive capacity, and not only interested but achieving breakthroughs in the ability to increase intelligence. In other words, techniques that allow a practitioner to observe the growth of cognitive capacity. So I equate three terms together. I'll use them interchangeably, and they are consciousness, intelligence, and cognitive capacity. These three, in this frame of reference, in this context, these three will be equal. So increasing intelligence is the same as increasing consciousness. If I increase consciousness, I increase intelligence. And I make a distinction between knowledge and acquiring knowledge and data through indoctrination or education and intelligence. So when I say intelligence, I'm not talking about the ability to articulate or the ability to manipulate information. I'm talking about a creative capacity that comes from an adequate education, an adequate socialization, but then expands much greater. It expands, it encompasses much more. So the way that works is by increasing cognitive capacity is the same as increasing consciousness, because it's undeniable, number one, that you're conscious, that you have consciousness, and it can be argued and known from experience that the best understanding or identification of what I am, ontology, the nature of being, is consciousness. In other words, since there can't be anything else than consciousness, in other words, nothing can be known about the self or of identity without consciousness being present, then consciousness has this totality or this primacy of not only knowing in the realm of epistemology, knowing, but also in the realm of being, as being. Because if there's nothing or no one or no entity conscious of, if there's no consciousness, then there's no knowing of anything, and there's no being either. There's no knowledge of the self. So humans, we say Homo sapiens sapiens, man, the knowing knower, means man knows that he has a sense of being in the world. He has, and when we say have a sense of being in the world, it means it can be described as a sense of what it's like to be me right now. So this is another understanding, a definition of consciousness, is that I know I have a sense of being in the world and what it's like to be me. And I also know that at some point, from everything I can see or that I can know now, is at some point this consciousness will end. We can't be sure of that because we don't know really exactly what happens after death, and no one can tell us that. But we have a feeling that consciousness will end someday, because we see that once the biological body dies, consciousness seems to end. There's no more brain activity, right? So no one knows whether this consciousness beyond brain activity, there's no evidence that there is as of yet. But to get back to the point that the definition of being and being consciousness are one and the same, because there's nothing without consciousness. So then we can see that everything that can be known, can only be known by consciousness. Any science, any type of information cannot be known without a conscious being, without a sentient being. Everything that's known, all the sciences, all the information, takes place within consciousness. So, intelligence is the language of consciousness. It's the functioning of consciousness. And just as there's a continuum of consciousness, lower levels and higher levels of consciousness, there's also lower levels and higher levels of intelligence. Lower levels and higher levels of cognitive capacity. But yet, consciousness is something more than either cognitive capacity or intelligence, because those two take place also within consciousness. We could have a rudimentary or a primitive form of consciousness without a high degree of intelligence. But we can't have a high degree of intelligence without consciousness. So once we understand that consciousness is the nature of being, then human nature is knowing. Being and knowing. And knowing and being can't be separated. In any sense of the word, in any logical definition, being and knowing cannot be separated. Being is knowing and knowing is being. So if there's some technique I can use to increase conscious capacity, then by the definition that I put forth, increasing conscious capacity increases both intelligence, knowing, a sense of being alive, being in the world, a sense of vitality, aliveness, and also increases cognitive capacity, the ability to do work, the ability to use the neurological apparatus, use the software, the wet work of the mind as a powerful tool. Because as I raise consciousness, all these things, this machine, this computer, this processor, increases in its capacity. And the way I do that, the way you do that, the way we do that is an evolutionary way. It's the latest in man's evolutionary capacity of mind. Mind is a very late comer on the stage of being, of life. Life is the latest in this creative evolution of the species, of biology. It can be argued that it's the greatest. In some sense, it's creation becoming aware of itself. So, if I can increase my awareness, my consciousness, means I increase awareness in all realms, because all realms of perception and knowing and problem solving and planning and memory and working memory and creativity and sensation and emotion, all these take place within consciousness. All these are part of the mind, and the mind is part of consciousness. So if I can increase my conscious capacity, I increase on all layers, on all dimensions of knowing, sensation, perception. And the way we do this is first by recognizing that I am conscious, and then one step further, I am consciousness. I am being and knowing equally. Once I recognize that I am, what I am is the primacy of consciousness, the primacy of the creative evolution of biology on Earth, then my focus becomes directed to, I become aware of being aware. My mind falls into the background, the spaciousness of consciousness. And because everything takes place within consciousness, like I said, like we referred to, it can't be argued that all knowing, everything that can be known, all experience takes place in consciousness, but yet we see that consciousness is never filled up. Consciousness is never full. We can say this about consciousness: there's no edge to it. You can't find a place where consciousness stops, where there's an end of knowing. There's just an endless stream of knowing, endless conscious capacity, endless knowing. It never stops. I can never get to the edge of my knowing. I can never find the boundaries of consciousness, and it's never full. I can put all the memories of a lifetime, of 10 lifetimes, within consciousness. All that experience will never fill, and consciousness continues to go on. There's no end to it. So we see this spaciousness. So when we recognize ourselves as consciousness, we fall into that creative, that endless creative spaciousness. That's the natural evolution of biology, of life. And we start to identify with consciousness rather than the phenomena passing through consciousness. We start to identify with our true nature. And this is the beginning, this is the dawning of intelligence. This is the dawning of intelligence. When we stop identifying with what we're told and what we're programmed to think and believe, when we cast that all aside, when we reject all that, we cast it out, we extinguish it. What we think we know, what we are told we are, and who we were told we are, and what we can know and can't know. And we start to identify instead with consciousness itself. And we remove all the doubts and all the garbage and all the filth and all the programming. The virus of society, the virus of misinformation, the virus of indoctrination, inculcation. We remove those programs from the system, and we're running with a clean, powerful processor of information. So the key is identification. And that's the beginning. Identifying what you truly are.